I'd now like to welcome Sarah Rees-Jones, Professor of Medieval History at the University of York.
Good evening. On the 16th of March, 1190, around 150 Jewish children, women and men were murdered or committed suicide in the royal castle in York. The event horrified contemporaries around Europe and is remembered today around the world. Within a generation, Jews did return to York. Indeed, the community flourished in the early decades of the 13th century, but eventually it fell victim to fresh rounds of terrifying persecution, this time instigated and enforced by royal government, that eventually ended in the expulsion of all Jews from England in 1290. Nevertheless, it is the massacre and the destruction of the first Jewish community of York in 1190 that remains the dominant public memory today of York's medieval Jewish settlement. This powerful memory is in part because the medieval authors, both Jewish and Christian, who wrote about the events in 1190, did so with the express intention of ensuring that the horror should be remembered by everyone, everywhere, forever, as an example of the terrible inhuman consequences of men losing their morality. The story of the massacre of 1190 may have been told as a story of events on a single day, affecting a single community, but even at the time it was understood that this was not an isolated event, and its causes and consequences connected people in York into bigger world issues and universal histories. There are two sets of historical sources from which we can learn about what happened here in 1190. First, there are the prosaic working records of royal government, in particular the financial records of the Royal Exchequer. In 1190, these listed 59 citizens of York who were fined substantial sums of money for the attack on the Jews. Whether because these citizens were directly involved in the violence or because they were the most important men then in the city, we are just not sure. This swift and punitive reaction by royal government is the clearest possible evidence that something terrible had happened. The second set of sources, written some years later, are the chronicles, both Jewish and Christian. The most detailed of these, the one that is nearly always quoted in modern accounts, was by the Christian monk William from Newborough Priory in North Yorkshire. His account tells us how the violence began on the 3rd of September 1189 at the doors of the coronation feast of King Richard I in Westminster. Jews gathered there to celebrate the coronation, including two of the leaders of the York community, Benedict and Jose. But they were attacked and anti-Jewish violence spread into London. King Richard decreed that all Jews were under his protection and should not be harmed, but he then left England to go on crusade. The violence then reignited, spreading from town to town up the eastern counties of England, reaching York in March 1190. In the week before Passover, the city caught fire. Under cover of the confusion that followed, enemies of the Jews began looting and setting fire to Jewish homes, killing the wife and sons of Benedict, who had already died from the wounds he sustained in London. The mob was led by a local aristocrat, Richard Malabes, who was in debt to Jewish financiers. Jews who were found in the streets were offered a stark choice: baptism or death. Many of the surviving Jewish community, led by Jose, took refuge in the royal citadel, perhaps the castle on this site. They did not know whom to trust and refused to admit the castle's own constable. Word spread, and armed mobs from the city and the surrounding countryside gathered around the castle and laid siege to it, surrounding it with siege engines. That night, the 16th of March, the great Sabbath, the Jews debated their fate. Among them was a famous Jewish scholar, Rabbi Yom Tov of Chouagny in France. In a speech imagined by William of Newburgh, he urged his fellow Jews to prefer a glorious death to the infamous life of false conversion, and so follow the precedent set by many of our people. Some, however, did choose to risk the mob, but the rabbi encouraged others to set fire to their valuables and the castle, and many men slit the throats of their wives and children before killing themselves. The next morning, survivors threw themselves on the mercy of the mob, pledging to be baptized. On discovering what had happened, many of the mob were horrified and moved to pity, but the original conspirators, encouraged by Malabis, murdered the survivors as they emerged from the castle. The York Massacre was neither an isolated nor a merely local event. The Jewish community in York was a very recently arrived one. They had lived in the city for no more than a dozen years, and had moved to York under royal protection at a time when the kings of England were trying to subdue the traditionally rebellious, even separatist north through a combination of military force, draconian new laws, and punishing taxation. As a result, the men of York and Yorkshire were in frequent rebellion against the crown, and the attack on the king's Jews was, in one sense, only one of a series of violent uprisings against royal officials, which resulted in Yorkshire both being seen as one of the most violent parts of the kingdom, and the citizens of York counting among the most severely punished of the king's subjects. William, in a sense, recognised this in the story that he told about the enthusiasm of the Jews of York, Jose and Benedict, attending the royal coronation, and their surprise at the hostility shown to them there, and also in his frequent allusion to the excessive wealth of the Jews that was the envy of their new neighbours. In this sense, he portrayed the Jews as outsiders to York and other provincial towns and cities, not because of their faith, but because they were seen as the agents of a royal government that was imposing itself upon local communities with unprecedented and unpopular efficiency. But William's sense of the historical significance of the events was wider even than that. Christians had lost control of Jerusalem in 1187, prompting calls for a new crusade, and this increased hostility to Jews as the enemies of Christ. York was the worst in a wave of anti-Jewish riots that spread across the whole of Northern Europe. William himself was appalled at the criminality of the lawless Christian mob, describing them as perverted in their misunderstanding of Scripture and as acting barbarously through the blackness of their malice. Yet he also constantly refers to Jews as perfidious, a Latin word which at the time meant hostile to the Christian faith. The very violence of his language indicates the state of high tension between religions within the context of international conflict and imperial ambitions. And yet, William very deliberately set these feelings within a near timeless, even longer world history. He himself, interestingly, said that there was a void of knowledge about exactly what happened in York on the 16th of March, 1190. And throughout his own text, he therefore drew extensively on the words and phrases of older histories, of scripture and of liturgy, in order to fill in the gaps in knowledge. In this way, his text was intended not so much as a simple account of what happened in York in 1190, but more as a model of enduring human sinfulness and the continuing need to strive for contrition and redemption. In describing the actions of Jews, he drew on the language of a Jewish historian, Josephus, who had lived nearly 1,000 years earlier in the 1st century AD, and wrote an account of the massacre and mass suicide of the Jews at Massacre in 74 AD. Thus, he deliberately constructed this story not as a factual account of what happened on one terrible night in 1190, but more as a testimony to the enduring suffering of Jews across the known world. York and Clifford's Tower were therefore replaced in William of Newbury's imagination by a wider understanding of world history, in which what matters are not the details of specific historical events on just one day, but the potential for evil and the moral obligations that exist between faith groups in all times and in all places. If we read William's chronicle in the way that he intended, then the memory of 1190 is as relevant today as it has ever been. Thank you.
We'll now hear from Mrs. Anne Morris, who was